Welcome to Dead Man Talking. Sometimes a lot of these encounters or sightings would start with simply a bang or strange noise in the distance or around the back of the house. Sometimes it's just a quick glimpse of a shadow or figure moving out your peripheral vision. Most of the time, these encounters, these strange sightings that catch our attention late at night, are simply a deer or a rabbit. Tonight's compilation of stories, we take a look at those glancing moments, those heart-stopping moments, and we enter the realm of our nightmares. Hope you all enjoy these collection of stories. Please, as ever, do like, comment and share. If you haven't subscribed to DMT, smash the subscribe button and tickle the notification bell to stay up to date with all DMT content. Without further ado, guys, let's get into tonight's first story, entitled "Its Legs Were Bent Backwards." It's been almost 2 months since I saw that thing. I was just minding my own business when I saw it outside. I can't sleep without fear. The constant worry but wonder that I might see it again by chance still lingers in my mind. I want to at least get another glimpse of it, but the better side of me says for it to stay away. Well, I should say the story of how I saw it, though I prefer not to recall it. I was in my house, doing a project for my schoolwork, when I looked up and out of the large centre window, when I saw movement out the corner of my eye. The thing I saw, slowly making its way across the road, was otherworldly. If demons had physical forms, then that thing I saw might as well have been one. It was a dark grey with no fur or hair. It had long, skinny arms and legs and was walking on all fours. But what really caught my attention was its hind legs. Its knees were bent at a 90-degree angle backwards. The upper legs almost looked like an extension of its own body. It didn't have any signs of a towel and looked like it almost had human-like hands for its front set of legs. I couldn't see its face, if it had one, and it was really huge. It was almost the length of half the road that it was crossing. If it stood up on its hind legs, it probably could have been 6 or 7 feet tall. It was already halfway across the road and I wouldn't have been able to get the binoculars without it disappearing into the thick forest. So I just stared at it in horror whilst contemplating if I should call my mother and brother to see it. I chose to stay silent because I didn't want them to worry about this place because we are outside a lot. It was moving very weirdly across the road and was taking very long steps even though its limbs were moving very slow. That night I couldn't sleep and the next day I looked up whatever the hell it could be. I couldn't find anything besides probably fake images of the rake and a skinwalker. I haven't seen anything like it since that day, and I'm glad about it. Though it still does pick at my mind what that creature could have been. I didn't have any witnesses because my mum and brother were on second floor watching The Hobbit. When I told them, they didn't believe me, and they probably still wouldn't. I know what I saw though. I know it wasn't my imagination because I'm not one of those people who can easily get reality and illusion mixed together. Have any of you guys ever seen or encountered something like this? If so, please comment what it was, and if you have any explanation on what this creature was. One thing I know is that I'm never going camping outdoors in my forest without a shotgun and a pocket knife. A potential encounter with a mimic/skinwalker. I must preface this with a few things. This encounter is second-hand, but was told to me on multiple occasions by the person that experienced this. I am a natural skeptic and cynic, so I can't say 100% I believe it, but his telling of it was pretty simple yet concise and did not vary between retellings. I've known this guy for many, many years, and his advice and input on just about everything is well reasoned and always helpful, so I'll just take his word on it, even with a grain of salt. Also, keep in mind I am not a seasoned writer and past and present tense may get a little jumbled, but I'll keep it clear and accurate as best I can. So, let's get down to business. My friend, we'll call him Marv, likes to go solitary camping on occasions to be one with nature and things that go along with that. He's also an avid gun collector and enthusiast. I don't remember exactly when he said this took place, but it was a few years back, and he decided to go camping on a whim. He packed his gear, a few guns, hunting rifle and a 4.5, and he headed out into the country on a vast property owned by his friend. He had full permission and the works. This happened close to the Kisatchie National Forest in south-central Louisiana. I won't be any more specific other than that. Safe to say it's miles and miles of forest and wilderness. He liked to hike in pretty deep and camp at a specific spot he found a few trips prior. These details are kind of sparse as it's not really the meat and potatoes to this encounter. So, he made his way in and set up camp in his usual small clearing for the night. Skipping ahead a few hours, it was now late afternoon when he heard leaves crunching and twigs being stepped on. He assumed it was an animal at first and got up from cooking something on the fire to try and get a look. He gazed in the direction of the noise and saw a man approaching through the trees a good many yards away. He has described his etiquette for dealing with other people in very remote places, cautious as more often than not. People he comes across are armed like him. He tries to stay as friendly as possible but still keeps his guard up, looking for any ulterior motives, as you never can tell what kind of folks are up there, out in the middle of nowhere. He'll make chit-chat with them, find out generally what they're up to if he can, and occasionally share a meal, etc. He's never really met anyone nefarious as yet, other than the situation, and maybe one other, but that's a whole other ordeal. So, one thing that sets off small alarm bells for him is he knows he's the only one with permission to be on this property, and secondly, this guy is not dressed for the location at all. He said the guy was wearing a white t-shirt, short blue jogging shorts, and white socks and sneakers. Mind you, Marv is miles out in the middle of woods, away from any paths, roadways, houses or anything really. Nobody is going to be casually strolling into his current location dressed like that, unless they are lost or confused. It was early fall but not quite cool, very normal for Louisiana. So there's a ton of mosquitoes, ticks and other insects aplenty. You're not going to have most of your skin exposed if you can help it deep in the woods. I know that all too well from personal experience myself. So Marv assumes something might be up and calls out, "Hey there, do you need help?" or something. Pretty loud. Definitely loud enough to be heard. The guy keeps walking forward, staring directly at him. Marv is starting to get unnerved, and as I said, I know this guy well, and he's cool as a cucumber in a tense situation. Getting more uneasy, as the guy is closing the distance, he gets to his feet and loudly declares, "Hey man, can I help you with something or what?" The guy is 15 to 20 feet away from Marv now, standing at the edge of the clearing and the forest. The guy looking at Marv dead in the eye speaks and clearly says,
"Help me."
Marv said he was already starting to actually get worried at this point because he could see the way the guy said this was as if something that he didn't know exactly how to talk was saying "help me," or at least what he first thought. It did not sound right. The guy, still unmoving, says,
"Help me."
Again, slightly more empathetic, but really just slightly louder. Marv said this is when he picked up on what was truly wrong about this. He said the timbre of his voice was more female, and it actually sounded like a recording being played back, and that the guy's lip and mouth movements weren't matching up with the phrase. It's like he was just opening his mouth, emitting the phrase, and closing it again. Marv asked, "What do you need help with?" Not daring to back up or move whatsoever. The guy, still standing motionless as well, still looking directly at him, said,
"Help me."
Again, and repeated the phrase another 3 times, slowly, but not louder in volume. Marv, now totally unsure of what the hell was going on, interrupts the guy by barking, "Alright, you need to go away unless you actually need my help." "Do you need my help or not?" He continued loud and firm in tone. The guy didn't miss a beat and started up with a "help me" again, and made it as if to take another step in Marv's direction. Marv told me that he did the only thing that made sense in the moment and drew his 4.5 semi-auto pistol and pointed it at the guy, telling him again, "You need to go. I don't care what you want." The guy starts to get more animated and agitated, actually starting to say the phrase louder, now over and over, but not stepping closer or backing away. Marv did what he thought was right given his current predicament, assuming he was dealing with an unstable or potentially dangerous individual, and discharged a round into the ground in front of the guy. Now this is where it gets fully batshit crazy. I'm not kidding. As the guy stops uttering the phrase, he goes silent, and still staring at Marv full on, backflips and somersaults like a gymnast does, backwards into the woods and immediately off out of sight. Yeah, you heard right. Now, I know what you're thinking because I had and still have the same reaction. That sounds like bullshit for sure, but Marv gave no indication of falsehood and told me this multiple times, each time in dead serious demeanour. Yet Marv said the guy backflipped away effortlessly, as if he pulled back by an unseen tension coil. He described it as completely humanely unnatural and totally out of place. The guy had just appeared and repeated the same phrase over and over, eventually becoming almost frantic before Marv shot at the ground before him, causing him or it to flee. Marv said he stood there, focused on the forest where the guy just flipped into, and saw and heard no further movement. It was like the guy had never even been there. He stayed like this as the sun began to set and the normal night noises crept in. As I mentioned before, Marv is a pretty unshakable fellow and actually stayed in the area for the night and the next night before returning with no further incident. When he had told me and some other friends about this, of course, we asked many questions. We asked him to elaborate on the guy's speech sounds. He said the more he thought about it after the incident, the more sure he was that it was definitely a female's voice coming from the guy. It was like he or it had heard someone say this and mimicked it like a parrot or other talking birds would. Almost like a lure. He doesn't know what it wanted. He or it, yeah, might qualify as an it, didn't give any indication to follow or utter anything else. He or it reacted immediately to the gunshot, and you know what followed there. He has been back to the property since, with no other strange occurrences. The only other minute detail that I can think of is he did remember hearing during the early morning of the first night what sounded like a gunshot off in the distance, and it did sound eerily similar to his 4.5. He thought he may have heard it again on the hike back out. There are people that hunt in the area, of course, and it could have just been that. He couldn't be sure. Since this incident, and one other that he had in a completely different location, he did some online research on the whole Kisachi area and found many legends, stories and supposed encounters dealing with skinwalkers and other unnerving bits of Native American folklore in the area. Not to mention mimics and other similar supposed creatures. A lot of his encounter lines up with these tales, but there's nothing tangible to prove it, of course. But even as a skeptic, it does make me wonder about strange things in the remote and untouched areas of our world that cannot be explained. So, I can attempt to answer questions about this, but I'm only going off of what I was told, so keep that in mind. I can potentially ask Marv about the ones I can't answer myself, as I should be hanging out with him in a few days. This is Marv's second encounter. I've only heard him tell this of a couple of times, so I know less details and specifics about this one. Similar to the first encounter, he went camping by himself, of course. This time on another friend's property, not that far from where we both live. It's a wilderness area, but only roughly an hour and a half walk to civilization, so not that remote. It's undeveloped property that's mostly woods. He checked in with the property owner by texting him to make sure everything was good and headed in. He had a usual, already picked out spot, as he has gone out to these woods many times. He's been out there for camping and target practice mainly, much more than the land near Kisachi for sure. He said his selected spot was an old, dry creek bed that is nice and flat and well sheltered. He set up his tent, got everything else set up, and started a campfire as usual. Unlike the mimic encounter, everything was normal into the evening and night. As he was tending the fire later in the night and preparing to turn in, he heard branches cracking and something large moving around in the trees, coming in his direction. But it was dark and he couldn't see anything. He's assuming it's a black bear, or a boar, or a deer, as those are the only large animals roaming around the woods generally in our part of the state. He doesn't get any strange vibes or anything yet, until he can see into the trees not that far away what looks to be a large set of antlers. No red flags yet, but the more he looks, the more he realises something is off. Instead of the antlers being 4 or 5 feet off the ground as you would expect with a full-grown buck, I'm estimating because I don't know the specifics of that, they appear to be 10 or 15 feet off the ground. He could tell this as whatever it was is standing next to a tall tree, and the antlers are even with the higher up branches and not the bare trunk, so pretty high up. Still confused but not yet concerned, he stays quiet and motionless to see what he's going to do. It makes no move, but now he's starting to feel like it's examining him. He can't get a good look at it and only knows it appears to be upright, but the only discernible trait he can make out is its antlers. A little time passes and the thing is still there, just watching him, and it's not making any move to leave or come closer. Marv is really not sure what he's dealing with, but is positive it's not an actual person effing with him, so decided to scare it away. He grabs his rifle, chambers around, and shoots past the thing, figuring it would flee at the sound. Like the other thing did, it doesn't. It just stays there, waiting, not making a sound. This is already a really weird situation, and he really feels like something is wrong. He's getting an overwhelming feeling like it doesn't want him there, and is trying to get him to leave. Like the mood and the atmosphere of the environment had changed. This is when he noticed it was very quiet. There were no sounds of birds, owls, etc., insects or wildlife, just silence. The oppressive feeling intensifies and he thinks that he's got to do something to put an end to this. He didn't want to run or get into his tent as to lose sight of the thing and have it chase him or attack him in his camp. So, similar to the mimic, he decides his gun is the only tool for the job and levelled it at the thing. He didn't yell at it or try to communicate with it in any way. He aimed and fired the multiple rounds its centre mass was. He said he's pretty sure he hit it as the shots made the same sound of a round thudding into flesh. I've never been hunting and shot an animal, so I don't know how accurate of a claim that is. It didn't wait around after this and crashed off back into the darkness. He could hear its pounding feet on the ground, branches being smacked into and broken. Unlike the mimic encounter, he said he felt a definite unwelcome feeling from this thing and a malicious intent before he decided to shoot at it. He can't explain it, but compares it to the effects that a large predator would have on the surrounding environment. The normal sounds of the night fade back in and again. He decides he's not going to leave. He assumes he's made it known to the thing that he wasn't going to let it intimidate him and scare him off, although he did not sleep and stayed up keeping his gun at the ready in case it came back. When dawn broke, he cautiously made his way to where he approximated it stood and looked for signs and prints. There was nothing. No prints, no blood, no hair, nothing whatsoever. The ground was undisturbed. He went a little further and looked for broken branches, and which he heard, and yet again couldn't find anything of either of them. He packed up camp and hiked out. He did tell this story to the landowner that day, and although the landowner had not had an encounter himself, he told Marv that his father and others who had gone hiking, camping and shooting in the area had reported similar instances, like hearing everything go quiet and the sounds of something large moving around. No one had ever seen the antlers of such a very tall figure though. When he told me this story, I found it kind of unbelievable, even more so than the mimic tale, as it sounds like something straight out of a horror novel, folklore or mythology. Speaking of folklore, my dad is very familiar with the area and the native tribes that lived here. It was the Atakapas and Opelousas tribes specifically. He heard stories growing up about creatures they claimed to have encountered in the area, and some of them are creepy similar to Marv's story. I don't have any specific info on hand to link to, but one of the stories passed down by these tribes was referring to an entity or spirit or nature guardian that appeared to young native men that they were supposed to stand up to prove themselves as a right of manhood. Or it could have been something they generally feared that they knew the only way to survive was to fight back. I've only heard vague telling of this from him, so don't quote me on that. Marv has been back out in the woods many other times before and after these incidents, and never had anything remotely like these instances happen. I should also point out he doesn't drink or partake in any recreational activities, so he was stone cold sober during these encounters. Make of this what you will. Wolf Creek in Hoax, Bluff. Let's get straight into that. Hoax, Bluff, Mum croaked. I looked over at her bed. I'd been sitting with her on a daily basis, spending time as dementia and Alzheimer's wove their destructive path through her mind, robbing her of herself, robbing us of her. Sometimes here in the final act she would say random things. Early on I tried to sift it all out and make sense of it. Maybe she's still in there. I'd lie to myself. Maybe she's trying to have a conversation. The doctors later told me it was literally just random things in her memory bubbling to the top. Like rolling a dice with a number assigned to a word or phrase. There was no rhyme nor reason. I've never heard Hoax Bluff before. I leaned over and touched her hand. What's that, Mum? Everything okay? She spoke again, but this time with more clarity than I'd heard in months since she'd taken what would be the last downturn. Hoax Bluff. There were 12 of us. I never went down. Never went down. Mary did, and MJ did, and Daddy did, but I never did. Wolf Creek. I'd never heard those names either. Mum, as far as I knew, was from Atlanta. She told me and my dad, years gone now, had confirmed that she'd lost her family in a house fire in Goldsboro, along with school records and belongings. They'd met while she was working at the Grant's department store in Atlanta as a waitress in the diner. That was the breadth and depth of my mum's past life to me, and it was fine. It suited her, and it suited him. So I wondered if it was what I was hearing was from a movie or a book. She slipped back into a half-waking daze, daytime TV unspooling in front of us both. We shared that as a form of togetherness, I think. Both of us rarely knowing what was on, neither of us really caring. As the afternoon waned, I kissed her on the cheek. Was that a ghost of a smile? I saw when I did. I still liked to think she was still there, and I left. When I got home, I went through the motions of being happy, telling my kids Gammy was going to be fine, just tired, sharing the long gaze with my wife who knew otherwise. I cooked dinner, and we laughed, watched movies, and we went on about our business. Later in the evening, I did some rudimentary web searching. I couldn't remember of what she said, but that place or person name, Hoax Bluff, stuck in my mind, so I started there. I didn't know at first if it was a hoax or hoax or what, but there it was, Hoax Bluff, Alabama. Well now, I did some more digging, looking for my mum's maiden name. That's when the dam broke. There were county records going back to the 1900s. Property taxes, deeds, school records, and family members. Morris Jefferson, Mary Edna. The list went on and on. A few grainy photographs that must have dated back to the 30s or 40s. And then Mum. A high school yearbook photo. Mum posed, looking demure but happy, holding a clarinet. Her head was swimming. Had Mum led a double life? What had she done to run away? Who were these other people? I felt excited, worried, and a little sick at heart. Hospital records didn't turn up anything embarrassing like an unwanted pregnancy. Back in the 50s and early 60s, an unwanted child was a scarlet letter in the small towns, I can assure you. No criminal records except one single incident of unlawful trespass by a brother with the improbable first name of Pitt, and that cost, according to the scanned-in, barely legible carbon-copied sheriff's report, the princely sum of $1.50, and a police writ to apologise to the property owner whose field he had accidentally trodden through on his way home from school. So much for a shady past, but it left more questions asked than answered. I knew trying to ask my mum anything at this stage, at the very, very best, would be giving me nothing but confused answers. The next day I showed my wife. She's always been interested in genealogy, so this fascinated her. Who were my maternal family? Why had they hidden? And where had they gone? I could barely sleep that night, turning these questions over and over in my head. The next day, I took my laptop to the hospice care. Mum slept most of the day. God bless her. I worked in near silence, the TV volume at minimum. I looked for Wolf Creek and found it. A narrow stretch of land, only zooming in maximally on the satellite image showed any actual creek. A thin razor of blue-black backing up against a very rustic-looking house on a plot of land. Oh, how I wish I could have just 5 minutes with the mother I'd known a decade ago, just to ask a few questions. There were 12 of us. I never went down. Never went down. Mary did, and MJ did, and Daddy. But I never did. Wolf Creek. Hoax Bluff didn't have its own newspaper, at least not back then. A comparatively large city called Gadsden was about 20 miles away, so I started looking there. The Times records weren't all in line, and the oldest back issues I could find went to the mid-1970s. A few years after I was born and we were living in Atlanta. I knew what I had to do. I was resolved to find out what my family had been, where they had come from and more. That night I talked to my wife about it at length. She was more than intrigued, she was fascinated. But living in the margins as we do, a grand investigative trip was out of the question. But my wife insisted. Besides, she said, it'll be good for the kids to know all about the family. Find something out, see if you can figure out more about your background. And you never know, there could be family-owned land up there or something. With that in mind, over the course of a long weekend, I chose to drive down to Etowah County and continue my search on the ground. When I pulled into Gadsden, late in the evening of the second day since setting out, I found a city that seemed permanently stuck in the late 1970s. A rusting steel mill dominates the west side of the town, an abandoned Goodyear tyre factory at the east. In between, depressed neighbourhoods full of crumbling homes ranging from white, 3-storey brick Georgian-style affairs to sagging wooden company houses from an era when the steel mill must have reigned supreme. No wonder Mum had wanted to leave this place behind. I settled in at a lone hotel in town on a Thursday evening. I'd likely only have that one day to dig through the archives by hand, and I'd probably come up with nothing. But I had to at least try. I kept in touch with the family, sending in plenty of photographs. Well, a few. There's damn little to the town that's photogenic, and even less outside of it unless long stretches of farm fields broken by stands of wood are your thing. Trying to gather as much as I could. The folks at the newspaper were initially small town suspicious, but when I told them I had, in their words, kinfolk from here, they opened up and treated me like long lost cousin, which, for all I knew, I really was. I dug into the archives, going back as far as I could, hitting dead end after dead end. My mum's maiden name was fairly common, and I would find leads that would take me to the points further south, indications about Florida, or as far away as Seattle, but nothing on the home front. Most of the papers from 1950s and 60s were intact, but a few, sadly, were missing, and thus hadn't been committed to the microfiche. I found an A section in the newspaper from mid-November 1963. You can, of course, imagine what the dominant topic was: the assassination of President Kennedy. Columns from various wire services around the world, how the county commissioner of Etowah was treating the tragedy. Would this mean war with Russia and Cuba? And on and on. I thought I'd hit the wall, until I found a clipping from a different week folded in the back of that issue. State Police Puzzled over Missing Family, by Charles Smiley. The mystery case of the missing family at Hoax Bluff has to date still stymied state police search efforts. Initial search efforts in the area have confounded the State Police Bureau, as due to the heavy nature of the woods and forested areas around the family's property, located just off of Route 23, Hoax Bluff, Alabama. Itinerant farmers who have worked for the family have been questioned, but so far nothing of interest has been found. The lone family member, my mother's name, has been remanded to a state home for children at the time of this column, and while authorities state she has attempted to assist them, nothing further has been discovered. Additionally, efforts have been hampered due to the loss of 4 search dogs in the wooded acres surrounding the family home. State police investigators on the scene have described the search as exhausting and the hardest going ever seen. Detectives have asked for any information anyone has about the disappearance of this family to please be phoned in the KL-4605. At the bottom of the clipping was an old photograph, captioned, "Still missing." It looked like something you'd see in a book about pioneers of the Old West. A dozen individuals, unsmiling, a stern-faced patriarch. Even the old yellowed newsprint showed touches of my mother's features. A rotund woman in a long dress, almost Mennonite in appearance. Her softer features echoed my mother's. 10 siblings. 4 boys, 6 girls. Beneath the photograph was a caption naming them all. All of them, as I read earlier online. I had struck the proverbial pay dirt. I took a photo of the clipping, hastily texted my wife, and looked up the route address. I zoomed down into Street View. It was nothing noteworthy, just a 2-lane country road lined by deep green woods on either side. Whenever the mapping car had gone through, there wasn't even a spot for a driveway. But the address was still on the map, so there was that. I scrolled further out and noted that a thin line of Black Creek abutted to the back of the property, as I'd seen before. I drove out Saturday morning, nice and early. Poking around the deep countryside any time close to sundown evoked images of winding up lost myself. I didn't relish the idea. At some point along the way, out that highway, my cell coverage dropped. Because of course it did. That's how these stories go, right? I lose cell coverage and I'm never heard from again. Jason Voorhees got me, I thought. I wondered how I'd find a non-existent driveway without any indicator. But, to my surprise, on the far side of the road from where I thought my destination was the stump of a wooden mailbox post, route number faintly visible. There was no sign of the box, but this had to be it. There weren't any other homes out this way. I parked far out on the shoulder, almost on the incline of a ditch, and hiked across the road into the trees. I had to push through a stand of saplings and tall grass as I walked up what I thought might have been the driveway. Once my foot thumped down on a piece of rotted plywood, or board, something like that underneath a covering of fallen leaves and pine needles. It wasn't a trapdoor or secret entrance, but a couple of rusting nailheads could have been seen when I swept the cover off with my foot. In a few dozen yards, the thicket gave way to a more open spot, still overgrown, but I could feel and hear the crunch of gravel under my feet. Then, as I broke out of that, I saw the house on a rise to my left. I actually got a bit of a chill. The run-down old place, missing a roof here and there, front porch completely gone, empty windows gaping open into the bright day. It looked positively terrifying. I marched up what looked like concrete steps to the side of the hill just the same. The house was a 6-room affair. It looked like a bathroom in the back and 2 bedrooms, one off the living room area in the front and the other past the kitchen. The floor sagged precariously and creaked with my steps. I wasn't going any further into the place than I had to. That was for damn sure. The windows, as I said, were long gone. The plaster had a faint tinge of green mildew on it. I pulled my shirt up and covered my nose and mouth. The only thing truly intact in the house was a stone fireplace. I could see shards of whiskey and wine bottles and a char of old fires in it. Someone had tried, unsuccessfully I might add, to spray paint a red pentagram on the stone chimney above. Apparently giving up symbology, they resorted to spraying Hail Satan on the stone mantelpiece. Arseholes, I muttered. I thought about entering the kitchen area, a couple of steps past the fireplace along with the floor sagging. Well, no, caved in, under the weight of the stove and a clear view of the drop-off behind the house's back rooms put paid to that idea. Besides, I was sure the police, over the years, thoroughly searched the house for evidence. So, no neat pile of 11 skeletons. No Texas Chainsaw Massacre House of Horrors, unless you counted some redneck metalheads' attempt at shock graffiti as horror. The whole thing was looking like a bust. Still, Mum had mentioned going down to Wolf Creek. Had something happened there? Was there a pool or pond or sinkhole where the family had gone to play without her and drowned? I had to know. I walked around the house and waded through the undergrowth, deeper into the verdant green woods. The mosquitoes were buzzing around, and carefully picking my way down the steep drop-off behind the house was slow going. By the time I got to the creek, I was sweating profusely. I had gotten more than a couple of scratches on my face and a couple of mosquito bites that were swelling up like nobody's business. My left eye felt like that of a prize fighter, almost swollen shut. The 2-3 odd mosquito bites on my cheek underneath my eye and on the temple of my head. I started to swear at the pain and itching as I stood there at the foot of the incline, but my voice failed. When I started to speak, it sounded flat, like I was speaking into a cardboard box. It was weird. I just felt uncomfortable talking, somehow. I looked up at the meandering creek, really no more than a trickle. It went further along to the north and deeper into the woods, and I mean into. The trees seemed to form a canopy in walls, green maple leaves, sweet gum branches, pine needles, oak leaves, holly and thorn bushes along the ground. As I looked at the path the creek took, I was struck by how the whole thing looked like a tunnel, a perfectly round opening for the creek and a little room to walk along its banks, all tapering inward. Strolling through the trees, I breathed the forest scent in. The smell was pleasant, loam and damp cool air. I didn't get that much in the sights of northeast. It was a nice change of pace from the usual. The further I went in, the dimmer the daylight seemed to get. Oh, and it was still bright outside, but the canopy of the forest was very thick. Only a few places here and there further up the banks of the creek were dappled with sunlight. Some distance out there was unbroken sunlight here and again, but it was like being under a huge pavilion tent, daylight at the perimeter, dim underneath. The banks of the creek grew steeper, and soon I was walking in a notch, having to walk in the middle of the creek. Eventually it disappeared and the ground just became a saturated bog. The walls of the creek bank rose above me, higher than my head, broader than I could reach with both my arms stretched out. I began to have to stoop and duck under thicker and heavier branches, stumbling here and again and falling. My jeans and loafers were soon sodden messes. Every time I thought I was stepping into a firm spot, I'd find myself ankle or shin deep in cold, stagnant water. I realised this was fruitless. I could walk from Gadsden to Knoxville, Tennessee, this way, and never see a living soul. I turned around. Fortunately, the banks were an obvious guide back from where I'd come from, and I started to trudge out. Rather, I tried to. Almost immediately with my first step, my left leg sank deep, knee-deep, into a mire. I had a moment of panic before I pulled it out, the water and the sand sucking at my foot. I had to pull my shoe out by hand. Every step forward took a minute or two. All the while branches, once green and inviting and shading, were now stabbing and slapping as I pushed past them. I must have touched a poisoned oak or stinging nettle. My hands began to itch and swell and burned every time I pushed against a branch to get out of the way, or a tree trunk or rock to steady myself. I was panting heavily. The cool, pleasant air was now stifling and hard to breathe. I stupidly reached up and rubbed at the itching mosquito bites on the left side of my face. Whatever was on my hands made it burn like fire, and my eye was reduced to a watery slit. Reduced to near blindness in one eye, I felt more than a twinge of panic. I finally, after what seemed like an hour, reached the bank. I could walk up and out without being in the water, but I kept tripping on kudzu vines. Every pitch forward I cut my hands on stones along the bank. The cloying scent of the undergrowth seemed to choke me. I took a deep breath in, but it felt like the air from a shallow pant. On the ground near the fallen tree, something attracted my gaze. A perfect circular object, blue-green with verdigris. I had no idea what it was. I scooped it up and scraped off the corrosion. It mostly crumbled away, but I could tell it was or had been a brass or copper button, about the size of a dime. I turned and looked at the path I'd come out. That's when I saw something else. A pair of wire-rimmed glasses frames, lying on the ground. Old, equally corroded, lenses gone. But there they sat nonetheless. I took a few steps back and picked them up. Hadn't someone in the family photo, Pitt, been wearing glasses? I thought about this place, about what it was, about what was happening. The sudden appearance of objects behind me, just like a tunnel. No, a funnel. Like a funnel spiderweb, trying to force me back in. I threw the artifacts back down and ran as best I could with sodden shoes, trying to find my way back up the gully, back to the house. More than once my foot was inexplicably wound up in the undergrowth like a snare. I had to yank my feet out, and once I thought I'd have to abandon my shoes. They were so caught up. The sure footing I found on the stones there on the incline were gone. I'd practically had to belly crawl up the slope. I chanced one more glance behind me. A sudden breeze kicked up, and the whole of the opening area seemed to undulate. If I'd seen it in a movie or read it in a cheap horror novel, I'd have laughed. But I felt like I'd been through a meat grinder, and I wasn't laughing. I was finally able to breathe when I got around to the front of the house. I wanted to throw myself down on the front step and rest. I felt like I'd run a marathon, but I didn't want to spend another moment here. I dreaded the run through the woods back to the road, but it was the only way out. Whatever was down in that gully, though, seemed powerless here. I shoved through the trees and weeds and staggered back out onto the highway, stumbling over to the car. Driving away as fast as I could, I dreaded every turn and corner I had to take. Would I turn the right way? Was this some cinematic nightmare where I'd drive to safety for hours, only to find myself back in front of the house, out of fuel? Nothing else came to pass though. I drove on back to Gadsden and got back to the hotel safely. I cleaned up a bit and spent the rest of the afternoon and evening in the hotel bar, nursing beers for a while. Without prompting her, the waitress brought me a nice ice pack for my swollen face. I didn't want to be alone, and I didn't want to spend another moment in this area. I checked my phone. Of course, I had reception again. There was one message from my wife from about an hour and a half previous, when I first walked behind the house. But when I listened to it, all I could hear at first was the faint sound of a television, too low to make out what it was, other than a burst of audience laughter. Then,
Jimmy, Jim, don't! Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out!
it was my mum's voice, high and shrill, but clearer than I'd ever heard in a year or more. Then, footsteps in my wife's voice.
Mum? Mum, it's okay. I'm here. It's okay. Nobody else is here. Here, let me take that. I don't think anyone called for you. Oh. Hey. Jim, hon, is that you? I'm here with your mum. Jim, everything okay? I went to the bathroom for a second. I left my phone on a nightstand. I guess she thought she'd given you a call. Love you. Call me when you get this.
I drove home through Sunday, getting home after midnight on Monday morning. When my wife asked me the next day what had happened to me, why I looked so rough, I don't know why, I just told her I'd fallen down a hill behind the house. I deleted the photographs I'd taken, threw away copies from the newspaper clippings. I don't know. I just told her I didn't find anything else, and I left it at that. That was 5 months ago. Mum passed away, only speaking one more time to me. A faint mumble, just the words,
I didn't go.
So, if you've ever been in the backwoods of northeastern Alabama, near Hoax Bluff, stay the hell away from Wolf Creek. Michigan, Dogman. This happened when I was about 7 years old to my uncle. He's no longer with us and I want to share his story. Growing up, I lived in northern Michigan on 5,000 acres of farm or ranch land that backed up into state land. Nothing but miles of forest and pasture could be seen. Needless to say, it made us pretty tough, and it takes a lot to spook us. We were all avid hunters, fishermen and outdoorsmen. Being the only girl, I was raised as a tomboy, and I'm just the same. My uncle went off to join the military, becoming a senior NCO in a prominent Special Forces division of the US Navy. He was 6'4", built like a wrestler, obviously skilled in survival tactics, and nothing rattled him. He was home on leave and went out hunting as it was deer season. I remember him coming in the house shaking and crying, saying he'd seen something in the woods. My uncle never cried. He was as tough as nails and would tear someone to shreds before he let them make him cry. My grandmother tried to get him to make sense, but he kept saying he saw Bigfoot mixed with a wolf. My granny immediately got my grandfather, and he rounded up the rest of the guys hunting my dad, a few male cousins, my uncle, who was still terrified but went because he didn't want to be labelled a chicken. They got all of their shotguns and ammunition and saddled up the horses to go clear the woods. Apparently, they were aware of the Dogman, but I was blissfully young and ignorant. They told me to stay inside, and for no reason was I to step outside of the house until they returned. I had never heard my dad or grandfather so serious, so I hid in my room. Sunset comes and they still aren't back. I'm really worried at this point because they never stayed in the woods until after dark. Shortly, I heard the sound of horses running to the barn and their voices. I was so relieved. They looked troubled when they came into the house but didn't say anything, probably not to spook me. At dinner, my dad laid down the law. I was no longer allowed to play outside or go to the barns alone. I had to have my grandfather with me at all times. Of course, I was upset by this and felt my independence was being taken away, but I obeyed. The next morning, my dad and grandfather taught me how to shoot. I knew it was serious. I overheard the adults talking the next night. Apparently, there were tracks where my uncle had his sighting, bigger than any wolf could make. But they were definitely dog tracks. As I said before, we are avid outdoorsmen and hunters. We can identify tracks easily, but these couldn't be identified. About 8 foot up in the tree were claw marks. No Michigan bear could make those. We also found claw marks of about the same height on multiple trees throughout the property. Had cattle mutilated and not in any way that a coyote or bear would do. And it lasted that whole winter. Altogether we lost 30 or 40 cattle that winter, all of them mutilated. All with the same wolf or dog tracks in the snow. I really feel like this experience changed my uncle. Who knows, he did multiple tours in the Middle East for Desert Storm and OIF, Operation Iraqi Freedom, before he committed suicide. After that experience though, he was never the same. He went from not ever drinking to never seeing him without a bottle of Jack, and his eyes were always haunted. He changed his personality and never went out into the woods again. He quit hunting, and he eventually just quit coming home to visit on leave. He didn't even come home for my dad's funeral 2 years later. It was heartbreaking to see him deteriorate the way he did. I truly believe he saw something out there, and it ultimately killed him. The Oregon WOLFMAN. Let's get straight into that. It all started when my friend Jeff decided we'd go camping. As kids, we went camping every summer. After turning 16 and getting our driver's licenses, we went camping almost every weekend during summer vacation. We spent our summers fishing, hiking, hunting and swimming all over northern Oregon. Now we're in our late 20s. I went to college and got my degree before going to work in the mailroom of a big law firm in Portland. Jeff was always more of a hands-on type. He hated school, so after high school, he joined the army and became a diesel mechanic. Jeff served 2 tours in Afghanistan before getting out of the army. He moved back into the Portland area and went to work turning wrenches at the Gibbets truck stop. We picked up our friendship where we left off, as we were like brothers growing up. Life gets in the way though. Between spending time with my fiancée and trying to attend law school part-time, Jeff and I hardly had time to hang out. So, when Jeff said he was taking 5 days of vacation and suggested we go camping, I jumped at the chance. It took some finagling, but I got my boss to give me the time off. We packed up Jeff's Jeep with tents, sleeping bags, a cooler full of beer and food, heavier on the beer, and some fishing rods, and of course a couple of guns, both for our protection and to do some plinking with. We left on Thursday around noon and headed for the mountains without a clear destination in mind. We drove out Highway 26 towards Mount Hood, past the town of Government Camp and up Highway 35 for a while. Then took a forest road north. Jeff had told me he'd been reading about some hike in the lakes with some amazing trout fishing that few people ever go to, because it's a 5-mile hike into the camp spots. Jeff was still in great shape and still stuck to a pretty crazy fitness regime. He kidded me for letting myself go and not doing much exercise. Still, I felt up to the hike. I'm not unfit per se, it's just that I hate running, jogging, climbing stairs or lifting weights. I may also have developed an unhealthy affinity for cheeses. That's a crazy hamburger for one of our food carts near my office. It's a bacon double cheeseburger that uses 2 grilled cheese sandwiches for the bun. I eat one of those and don't eat dinner most nights. as I'm still full from lunch. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon when we reached the trailhead. I looked at the trail and started to have second thoughts, because it took off at a pretty steep climb for the first 100 feet before disappearing in a thicket. We grabbed our backpacks and Jeff and I each took a handle on the cooler. The going was tough. My legs weren't used to such physical activity and they burned and ached after that first 100 feet. But then it wasn't so bad. The trail actually flattened out and meandered through the woods for about 3 miles with gentle rises and falls. The 4th mile was pretty grueling as the trail descended through the woods on a steep hillside with lots of switchbacks, and the trail narrowed and we found ourselves both walking off trail while the cooler hovered above the narrow beaten path. I admit that we stopped to rest 3 or 4 times along this stretch. We were too far in to turn around and go somewhere else easier. The last mile was the easiest, mentally and physically. At the bottom of the steep hill, the trail widened out and crossed a flat, flower and grass-covered meadow. We reached the lakeside about 7 o'clock. Mount Hood was just to our southwest, and it cast a shadow over the meadow. There was a more or less bare area on the ground, about 30 feet from the shore of a small lake, and in the middle of the bare spots was a ring of large rocks. There was a small, black burned chunk of wood still in the middle of the ring. It was getting dark fast, so I suggested that we divide up camp, set up chores. I would put up the tents while Jeff gathered enough wood for a campfire to cook dinner over. I'm pretty good at putting up tents, and we both bought simple, square 2-man tents, which any true camper knows is really only big enough for one person and a small pile of gear. I'm fairly tall, so I have to sleep corner to corner, as the tent's about 6 feet long on a side, and I'm 6'3" tall. Jeff is shorter. He's only 5'10", so he fits more comfortably in his tent. I had each tent erected and staked down in about 20 minutes, including rolling out sleeping bags and stowing bags. Jeff had accumulated a small pile of small diameter branches, nothing bigger than 4 inches in diameter. He was bringing them back by the armload from the woods, which were about 200 feet or so across the meadow. We both began breaking the wood up. It was pretty dry and brittle, so we didn't need a hatchet. When we stacked our wood after breaking it into foot-long chunks, we were disappointed by how small the pile was. It would be enough to burn down for dinner coals, but there wouldn't be much left for campfire after. Sitting around the campfire is my favourite part of camping. Staring at the dancing, flickering flame, zoning out and letting my mind turn off is relaxing. It's almost hypnotic. Sharing the experience with a good friend is even better. We've had some epic talks around a campfire. Jeff had the fire going quickly, and in 20 minutes or so we had a pile of coals big enough to boil our small coffee pot full of water over. The boiling water would be added to the dehydrated food we brought for dinner. Mountain House beef stew tonight. And we added some coffee grounds and made a pot of coffee to sip on while enjoying the peace and quiet. 1 or 2 cups of coffee don't have much effect on me as far as energy, so I can drink it and still fall asleep. Jeff had 1 cup, and we let the rest cool overnight and reheated in the morning with breakfast. I don't know what time it was when we finally turned in for the night. For a long time we both sat in silence, watching the little fire die out, then turning and staring out over the lake before us. Watching the black, oily water shimmer and ripple in the moonlight was eerie. The moon was high, and it wasn't quite a half moon, but it was bright. I went to sleep pretty quickly after crawling into my sleeping bag. It smelled a bit musty, as it had been stuffed in my closet for a few years without being used, but I didn't mind. I fluffed my pillow, and soon I was snoring. A blood-curdling scream that sounded like it was right outside my tent made me shoot bolt upright. My heart felt like it was in my throat, and it was pounding in my ears. "What the fuck, dude? Are you okay?" yelled Jeff. It took me a second to process what he said. Yeah, I'm okay." "What the fuck was that?" I heard Jeff's tent unzip. I saw his flashlight flick on and I heard him moving around. Pulling my boots on, I dug my Glock pistol out of my bag and quickly climbed out of my tent to join him. Jeff had his Beretta in one hand and a flashlight in the other. We looked around the ground outside the tent for tracks. We scanned the meadow, thinking we'd see a cougar or bear, or maybe even a wolf. Wolves were reintroduced into Oregon some years back, and I remembered reading a news story about one particular wolf with a radio tracking collar that had a range of hundreds of miles and had been reported to be in the general area a few months ago. We didn't find a thing, and we stayed up for a couple more hours, sitting with our camp chairs back to back so nothing could sneak up on us. Jeff finally was convinced we were fine, that it was probably just a cougar scream across the lake, and the water made the sound carry. It seemed plausible enough to me. It took me a while to get to sleep again, but finally exhaustion won out, and I fell back to sleep. The bright morning sun woke me up around 8 o'clock the next morning. Jeff had already been up for hours, and he had gathered more wood and was starting the breakfast fire when I unzipped my tent. Our camp chairs were not where I remembered them, and I asked him about it. Jeff shook his head. I was going to ask you. I thought maybe you couldn't sleep and got up and sat watching the lake or something. I found your chair over near the water's edge. It actually had me concerned at first, but then I heard you snoring, so I figured you hadn't drowned or something. No, man. I went to sleep and stayed asleep till just a few minutes ago. You're pulling my leg about the whole chair thing, right? I asked. A shiver went down my spine, but I couldn't help but think Jeff was playing some sort of prank on me. It's not like we didn't do it to each other once in a while. We cooked eggs and bacon over the fire in a lightweight mess kit frying pan. We decided to do some fishing after the breakfast. The fishing was good, lots of fat trout from 12 to 15 inches. Jeff landed a large one, about 20 inches, and decided to keep it and kill it for lunch for us. He whacked the fish on the head with a rock to kill it quickly, then gutted it and wrapped it in damp grass and placed it in the shade to keep while he continued to fish. We had the fish for lunch, along with some dehydrated Spanish rice, thanks to Mountain House again. After lunch we decided to explore some more and gather up a lot more firewood for the night's fire. Hiking about an hour further into the forest from the campsite, we discovered a chilling sight. Piles of bones. Rib bones, leg bones, broken hip bones, and some looked human, others distinctly not. There were 2 rib cages that were almost complete. Some still had drying, decaying meat left on them. Jeff took his digital camera out of his shirt pocket. Dude, no one is ever going to believe us unless we get pictures of this crazy shit. He started snapping away. I kept nervously looking around, hoping not to see whatever predator had left this behind. I'm no expert on bears, wolves, cougars or coyotes, but I had serious doubts any of them were responsible for this mess. Jeff took a couple dozen pictures before putting his camera back in his shirt pocket and buttoned it up. As we were walking back out the way we came, we stopped. Neither of us had seen it on the trail on the way in, but there, laying right next to the trail 15 yards from the bone pile, was a freshly killed juvenile elk. Blood looked to be oozing out of its mouth, and there was a large tear in its flesh on the left side, and some of its guts were just poking out. Let's get the fuck out of here, Jeff said in a firm, low tone. I did not argue, and we quickly marched along the trail, scanning the area as we went. Back in camp, we didn't immediately begin discussing what we saw. I think we were both still processing it, trying to figure out what the hell it was. I was the first to speak up. It must be a cougar then, or something nearby. That would explain the scream. And the elk? Jeff shook his head. I didn't see any other cougar sign, no scat, no prints. I'm not convinced it was a cat. He began to shake a bit, as if he was repressing something that scared the hell out of him. Finally, he blurted it out. I saw something like this before. It was on my second tour. He stopped, cracked a beer open and took a large swig. My unit got a call to come assist the convoy that had got shot up outside some shitburg little village. I don't know the name, never learned it, never cared to learn it. Wasn't important. I didn't think so at the time anyway. A convoy running supplies to a remote FOB came under fire from Taliban gunners. They had a big machine gun similar to our 50 cal. It shot out the engine blocks in 2 of the supply trucks and shot up radiators in 2 others. We had this special tow trucks. They were basically a semi with this big lift that snapped into the 5th wheel hitch and hooked up to the hydraulic pump on the truck. We would go out and recover vehicles that couldn't be repaired in a field. And we also sent mobile repair teams out so the truck drivers could complete their mission. My unit dispatched 2 heavy rigs, and they sent 4 of us plus a parts truck to try and do field repairs on the others. It seemed like we drove for hours before finally reaching the convoy. My buddy Mike was one of the truck drivers tasked with towing the disabled rigs. We helped unload the gear from the 2 dead trucks and crammed it into the remaining vehicles. An additional ranger squad had been dispatched too, to reinforce the one assigned to the convoy escort. They provided security, but the shooting had mostly stopped by the time we arrived. I helped Mike get one of the broken trucks loaded and onto his lift, then set about helping my partner, Dan, on repairing the radiator on another truck. We worked in teams to minimise the downtime and minimise the risk to ourselves. We were sitting ducks. He finished his beer in the next gulp. Dan and I got out the truck and two other guys, Jose Del Larogas and Joey Truman. They got out their truck running enough to move. The LT in charge of the Ranger escort ordered us to move out, and we could finish the repairs at the FOB. Our grease monkeys were stuffed into the back with the gear, but we didn't mind. It acted as a sort of armour to protect us in case we got shot at. Maybe 30 minutes into the trip, I asked another guy how much longer we thought we had until we reached the base. I never heard his response, as gunfire opened up and we started taking rounds, including mortar rounds. The truck sped up until the Towleys got a lucky shot and got a direct hit on the lead truck with a mortar round. God help those poor bastards inside it. We dismounted and everyone began engaging the enemy. A couple of the Rangers checked on the guys in the destroyed Humvee, but it was useless. There wasn't enough to even ID without DNA lab. We couldn't recover the remains while they were taking fire. The senior NCO of the Ranger team took command and we regrouped and rolled out again while the Rangers called for air support. We didn't go far before making it into a valley just past this little shitty village. Maybe half a dozen mud brick buildings in a loose circle, the farmers from which were probably the ones shooting at us. The shooting stopped and we thought we were home free. We lost radio contact with the FOB. The damned radio just wouldn't get a signal in this little valley. The Ranger sergeant told the lead driver to speed up, as we were too vulnerable down in this little valley. We bounced and bumped along, and then all of a sudden, we stopped again. Everyone scrambled out of the trucks and took up a security perimeter. What the fuck? Called out one of the other NCOs. Why are we stopping? He ran up ahead to the lead truck. The two sergeants surveyed the road ahead, and Dan and I strained to hear. Mount up! Called the sergeant, so we all got back into our vehicles. The trucks proceeded slowly ahead. Dan and I and a handful of others watched the road as we passed by. There were bodies. Taliban fighters, these little native deer and other indeterminate bodies in various states of decay. Some missing flesh. There were rib cages laying around, piles of bones, just like what we saw back up there. We made it to the FOB about 30 minutes later. Us mechanics wound up flying back to our own base in a Black Hawk helicopter that brought in the SOF guys. There must have been 24 of them, which seemed damned odd. It was one of the few times I've ever met any of them. I will never forget the scene. All those bones, the bodies, the blood. My blood chilled with Jeff's tale. Did you ever find out what it was that caused the mess? I asked him. Jeff shook his head. I tried asking him. My first sergeant told me to shut up and mind my own business. I didn't need to know. It was interesting that whenever we got called out to that region though, we had 2 full Ranger squads escort us, and we rolled in light armour vehicles, not a regular 5-ton truck. I won't argue if you want to break up camp and head home, dude. That was some weird shit, I said. Jeff shook his head. Nah man, we came out here to relax, recenter. It's okay. I'm sure that pile back there was just from a cougar or maybe a wolf. We just got to keep alert. He cracked another beer and took a swig before speaking again. Why don't we go see if we can catch a few more of those trout? He slapped me on the shoulder. I tried putting the scene of those bones out of my head and concentrating on the fishing. After an hour or so, I just got into the rhythm of casting my lures, occasionally catching a trout. We both kept a few fish for dinner. We were especially hungry. Dinner was pan-fried trout with potatoes and onions that night, washed down with an ice-cold beer. We skipped the coffee that night, but we sat up with a campfire. There was no chatter between us. We both let our senses wander, watching the meadow, the tree line, and the lake. A scream came from across the lake, the same blood-chilling, bone-shaking scream from the night before. We both snapped our gaze to that direction, straining to see in the darkness. Jeff's gun was in his hand in a flash, and he grabbed his flashlight from his pocket. We both took to carrying our guns openly, instead of our packs after getting back from our earlier exploration. What do you think it was? I asked. I have no clue, Jeff said. He shined his flashlight along the lake shore, our eyes following the beam. Then we saw the glow. Eyes shine. 2 eyes. Large yellow eyes, about 6 or 7 feet above the ground and maybe 200 feet from us. I fumbled my pistol out of its holster, feeling my heart rate skyrocket. We couldn't see anything but the eyes, as it was too far away for a small flashlight to really illuminate. What the fuck? Jeff said. The eyes began moving slowly towards us. I quickly grabbed my flashlight from my backpack and shined it in the direction of the unknown beast. We lost sight of it for a moment when the eyes dipped below the tops of the reeds on the lake's edge. Jeff whispered that we should move behind the tents to obscure us from the creature. I didn't argue. Standing in the open meadow in the dark, I felt exposed and vulnerable and scared. Then the eyes reappeared in a flashlight beam. It was close enough now to make out a black mass surrounding them. The figure was huge. It seemed to be moving on 4 legs. That's a big goddamn black bear or something, Jeff said. We didn't have any other native bear in Oregon, and black bears usually didn't get much bigger than a large human. This thing looked like the size of a VW bug. Besides that, black bears didn't stand erect on 2 legs, and this thing had most certainly been standing on 2 legs when we first saw it. We heard the creature's heavy footfalls. This time it was coming on all 4s. Jeff began shooting at it. The loud pops hurt my exposed ears, and a loud ringing filled them. The creature stopped, and even over the ringing, I heard that blood-chilling scream, and it raised up on its back legs. It looked, in the moonlight, to have arms with hands. Jeff fumbled for his spare magazine, and I opened fire from my Glock. I kept shooting up until the slide locked back 17 rounds. Jeff brought his gun back up while I fished a spare magazine out of my pocket. We both stood there, too afraid to run, nothing to hide behind but our flimsy tents, and Jeff fired again. The creature screamed again and fell back onto all 4s before turning around and rushing back into the darkness in the direction it had come from. My ears hurt and were still ringing. Jeff's words sounded underwater. What the was that thing? I shook my head. I don't know, man. It looked like a big wolf or something to me. We need to get the hell out of here. Jeff agreed. We decided it was safer to try hiking back to the cars in the dark than to stay there and camp another night. We took turns reloading the magazines from a box of target ammos, fished out of Jeff's bag. I dug a headlamp with a red filter out of mine and strapped it onto my forehead. We scanned the area one last time before leaving, and there was blood everywhere. A lot of blood, dark, sticky blood. We definitely hit this thing, whatever it was. If it was human, there's no way it could have survived that much blood loss. We set out back up the trail towards the car at a fast pace, not a jog, but a fast walk. We didn't want to stumble and fall or injure ourselves. Off, in the distance behind us, we heard the scream again. A moment later we heard another scream answer it. This one was much closer to us. Neither of us said a word, but we quickened our pace. We reached the woodline and the steep part of the trail. I turned on my red lamp and scanned the trail ahead of us before turning it off. We headed up the trail. At the first switchback, Jeff grabbed my arm and whispered for me to stop. We stood in silence, listening. Far off in the distance we heard brush rustling, branches snapping. Whatever it was headed our direction. He tapped my shoulder and we moved up the trail quickly, but trying to stay quiet. At the next switchback, we stopped again and listened. We didn't hear anything. I felt uneasy. The next leg would take us back closer to whatever it was that was coming for us. The alternative was worse though, a near vertical scramble up a loosely packed hillside, which in the daylight may have been possible, but at night it was almost a sure way to fall and injure ourselves. Jeff whispered for us to move slower and listen. He had his Beretta in hand. It took us almost 20 minutes to reach the next switchback. We heard the heavy creature moving through the brush again. This time it sounded like it was only 50 or 60 feet away. We turned on our flashlights and scanned the brush. The ground cover was thick here, and we couldn't see anything at first. But then we saw the eyes. Big yellow eyes. It screamed, and I almost fell on my arse, stumbling backwards. Jeff took 3 shots at the thing, and it screamed out again. This time a more painful scream, and the eyes disappeared. We ran up the steep trail towards the next switchback. Near the top of this trail leg, I tripped over a root on the ground and fell, hard on my face. Jeff cursed and reached to give me a hand. We heard a crash through the brush and suddenly something grabbed my leg. I felt a hot, sharp pain on my calf. I screamed, "Jeff!" Jeff's gun went off again and the creature screamed. I felt the pressure let go of my leg. Jeff helped me to my feet and I tried moving, but my leg didn't want to work. I fell again. I used my flashlight and looked down to discover my leg was covered in blood and a large gash or bite mark on it. Exposed muscle was visible in a bloody, muddy mess, and I threw up. There was a crashing sound from the brush again, and then Jeff screamed, and his gun went off one more time. I heard a thud, and I whipped round to see his gun on the ground, and Jeff was nowhere to be seen. I heard some crashing through the brush, moving rapidly down the hill. "Jeff!" I screamed, but there was no response. I crawled over and grabbed his gun, and there was an empty round stuck in a closed slide. A stovepipe, we called it. I jacked the slide back to clear the jam and loaded another round. "Jeff!" I screamed again. Silence. I don't know how long I sat there. Minutes? Hours? I don't know. I called out a couple more times and there was no response. I cried. I began shivering and I realised I was going into shock. I stuffed Jeff's gun into my waistband and tried standing up. I couldn't. I began crawling up the trail. I came to terms with the fact that I was probably going to die out there, but something made me go on. I don't know how long it was until I reached the top of the hill, but I know that sky was beginning to get light. I couldn't hear anything anymore. I couldn't hear the leaves, the wind. I couldn't even hear my own heartbeats in my ears. I wanted to scream, but couldn't. I rested myself on my pack. I tried crying, but I was dehydrated and couldn't even shed tears. I laid there as everything slowly
went black.
I woke up in hospital bed in Portland, and a man was there in my room. He was an older man dressed in a grey suit with a red neck tie, and he wore a grey trilby hat. "Good morning," he said when his eyes saw my eyes flutter open. I tried sitting up. "Whoa there, fella, whoa," he said. I couldn't place his accent. It seemed almost like a country boy. But he raised his hand. "Don't try to speak yet. You got a breathing tube in you." I hadn't even noticed and called for the nurse. The nurses and a doctor came into the room, removed the breathing tubes and helped me sit up. The man didn't even say another word until they left the room. He closed and locked the door and scooted his chair over next to my bed. "I'm glad you're awake. I was wondering if you'd ever going to wake up," he said with a twang that I was beginning to recognise as a Texan accent. My head was foggy. I hurt all over. "My name is Mr. Phillips. I work for the US Forest Service. I have some questions for you. Do you feel up to answering them?" "Just a few." I nodded my head. "You're probably wondering what happened, how you got here," he said. I nodded again. "We found you. Our expedition team did. You were on a trail out on Mount Hood. Glad we got to you when we did. You were almost dead." He picked up a water bottle from the nightstand and took a sip. "Your leg was torn open and you lost a lot of blood. We tracked that blood for half a mile down the trail. Can you tell me what it was that did this to you?" I shook my head and tried speaking. My voice cracked. My throat was dry. "You wouldn't believe me." He smiled. "Try me." I sighed. "It looked like a giant wolf. Bigger than a grizzly bear. It was all black and had yellow eyes. And it stood on two legs. It screamed like nothing I've ever heard." The man thought for a moment. "Your friend that was with you, Jeff Phelps, when did you last see him?" My heart began racing as he finished this question. "It was on the trail. I choked back tears. "I had tripped. We were running up the trail. Jeff stopped and was helping me up. The beast grabbed my leg and Jeff shot it. And I let go. Then he was gone." I couldn't hold back anymore and began to sob. My throat burned and it took a moment to gain my composure. "No," I said. "That's not right. He screamed first. Then he was just gone. I heard the thing as it bashed through the brush, headed down the hill. It must have taken him. I called out to Jeff, but he never answered. I don't know how many times I screamed for him. I couldn't stop screaming for him." "What made you leave camp in the middle of the night?" the man asked. "The creature. One came toward our camp and we shot at it. It seemed to run off away. We decided we couldn't stay the night, so we grabbed our bags and headed out. though I thought it would be best if we tried making it to Jeff's jeep, rather than stay and risk another encounter with the wolf thing. We heard it scream as we ran up the trail, and then there was another scream, closer to us. There were at least 2 of them. Did you ever see anything else while you were down there, or was it just the wolf? He asked. I nodded my head. Earlier that day we were exploring the forest near the lake, and came across this weird pile of bones and rotted meat. I thought we'd stumbled into a cougar's feeding area or something. We beat feet back to camp, and Jeff told me about a time he'd seen something similar when he was in service. Did he tell you what it was that made the mess in Afghanistan? The man asked. How the hell did he know Jeff was deployed there? Maybe he just guessed. No, he said he asked about it later and was told to mind his own business. I think that's enough questions for now, the man said and began to stand up. I raised my hand to stop him. Did you find Jeff? I asked. The man shook his head. No, we don't think so. You don't think so? I wondered. What the hell did that mean? Phillips then continued. We did, however, find a backpack that had a small digital camera in it. I do believe it belonged to Mr. Phelps. The man gently shook my hand. I'm sorry for your loss, son, he said, and then turned and walked out the door. Wow, hope you guys have enjoyed this. Of course, please do let me know down below what you thought, guys. As ever, please do like and share. I hope you've had a wonderful weekend, everybody, and are looking forward to an even better week ahead. Keep safe out there. And remember, if you go in a deep, dark woods, keep your eyes on your surroundings, especially in the trees and the shadowy. And remember, be safe, not sorry.